Hello, it's Father Tom Hoare here. I'm saving this chair for Deacon Steve DiMartino. Deacon Stephen is going to provide the reflections for our February Healing, Hope, and Recovery program. So you'll be wanting to tune in and invite others to join in the program through our subscription series. Deacon Stephen will be talking about coming to believe and what it means to deepen our intimacy with God through prayer and meditation, which really is the 11th step. But that coming to believe is something that all of us need to reflect upon. I know you'll enjoy Deacon Stephen. He'll be joining us in our community conversation in the third Wednesday of February. God bless you, and look forward to chatting with you soon.
Hello and welcome to the Enders Island presentation on recovery. My name is Deacon Stephen DiMartino, and I'm speaking to you today from my office at St. Joseph Seminary in Yonkers, New York. And I'm speaking on behalf of St. Edmund's Retreat Center and the director there, Father Tom Hoare, a priest of the Society of St. Edmund and the director of the Retreat Center, St. Edmund's, which is located on Enders Island in Connecticut, a place of healing, a place of reflection, a place of recovery. It's my privilege to have this opportunity to share with you today some reflections on the spirituality of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous and other addiction recovery programs. Many academics and scholars in the last 50 years have said that the spirituality of the 12 steps is the greatest contribution to spirituality of the 20th century. That's a very strong statement. And I think I would say that I concur with that statement. The spirituality that's contained within the 12 steps is essentially a distillation of many of the articles of faith of our Catholic tradition, as well as elements of spiritual schools and systems from other places. We need to acknowledge the reality that the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith, were raised as faithful Christians. That was their tradition, which meant that they were also exposed to the Jewish tradition, as all Christians are. And they were practicing their faith. And that is part of the historical context of their creation of the 12 steps. And let me share with you as we get started here in this presentation with a quote from the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, page 86. And this is what Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob have to say about the higher power, about God. We cannot get along without prayer and meditation. On awakening, let us think about the 24 hours ahead. We consider our plans for the day. Before we begin, we ask God to direct our thinking. Our thought lives will be placed on a much higher plane when we start each day with prayer and meditation. We conclude this period of meditation with a prayer that we will be shown through the day what our next step is to be. The basis of all our prayers is, Thy will be done in me and through me today. So, sisters and brothers, as we begin to think more about what is the spirituality of the 12 steps of AA and the other addiction recovery programs, we go from that understanding on page 86 of the Big Book to the actual 12 steps themselves, in which Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob, in 3 very clear steps, talk about spirituality. In step number 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. So going outside of ourselves to ask for assistance. That's one of the core principles in spirituality. I am not in this alone. And the third step, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood God. A second core principle in the spirituality of Alcoholics Anonymous and of recovery is the understanding that there isn't just a power greater than myself, but that power that's greater than myself is available to provide me with assistance, the will of God to move me in the right direction, to help me understand how to take care of myself. And then in step 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood God, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. The third core spiritual principle in the 12 steps is the notion that my contact with God is in fact a relationship. And as I cultivate that relationship, I begin to understand that there's more than just my will. I begin to understand that the world is larger than my own personal sufferings and unmanageability as a person in recovery. And I begin to understand that the more that I focus on cultivating intimacy with my higher power, the more energy and desire I have to be in service with others. So those are the quick overview. And as one of our great scholars of spirituality in the 20th century said, transformation has little to do with intelligence, willpower, or perfection. It has everything to do with honesty, humility, willingness, and surrender. And so being a person of faith starts with being accepting of what has happened. Being able to say, I am struggling with the disease of addiction. It took away my ability to control myself. In the first step, I've become powerless. My life has become unmanageable. It doesn't matter how smart a person is, their natural intelligence. What we have learned from many decades of accompanying people in their recovery process is that willpower is not sufficient to maintain proper focus in recovery. I can't do this by myself, and I have to want it. I have to make a decision to say yes to sobriety, but for that decision to take hold in my life, I need to reach out for assistance in the spiritual realm through prayer and meditation, as the 11th step teaches and suggests, and in practical ways by holding on to my brothers and sisters, especially during the tough times, and asking them to assist me in order to stay sober. That's the honesty. I can't do this by myself. That's the humility. No more ego-driven decisions, but instead the humility to say, I need help from others. That's the willingness to say that, to come into a fellowship room, to come to a retreat, to speak to someone with wisdom and sobriety and say, I can't do this by myself. And that's the surrender. It's a surrender to the strength of the higher power. It's a surrender to the support of a community that wants to be of assistance, and as such becomes a paradox, because in our mainstream culture we often see surrender as something negative, as a weakness, as a sign of defeat. In recovery from addiction, surrender is instead an act of willful giving over to the truth, and becomes, therefore, a great statement of strength. I am honest enough and humble enough and willing enough to say that I can't do this anymore, and that I need your help in order to not do this anymore, to break the cycle of active addiction and all of the attitudes and behaviors that come with it. It takes great strength to come to that point of awareness. It takes great humility to ask for help. And it takes great wisdom to surrender to the truth and to begin the process of putting the pieces of my life back together again. Another wise scholar says, the only cure for possession is repossession by something greater than the disease, the active disease of addiction. And that's why Bill Wilson said that the program of recovery that he outlined in the big book of AA and then the first expression of the 12 steps is a spiritual program, not a medical program, not a psychological program, not a family program, but first and foremost, a spiritual program. Because of what I have said about the nature of transformation, honesty, humility, willingness, surrender, prayer, and meditation, those are what condition the possibility for sobriety. And then as sobriety unfolds, the use of psychological supports, the repairing of the physical body, the attempts at undoing the unmanageability, the family reconnecting or reconciling when possible, all those are important, but it starts with surrender. And that's what I'm trying to share with you today. So if we take a little bit of a deeper look at this and say, where does this notion of surrender to a higher power come from? And it comes from the spiritual traditions of Western civilization, the Judeo-Christian tradition and the tradition in Islam. And what I mean by that is we go to the sacred texts, the Holy Scriptures, the book of Genesis, the first chapter in the book of Genesis, in which we hear the creation story of how the higher power, of how God called us into being. And we learn two really important things in that first chapter. The first thing we learned is that we are created in the image and likeness of God. And so all of that emotional and psychological baggage that accompanies active addiction with the messages of I'm a bad person, I don't deserve recovery, how could I possibly contribute in any positive way to the world around me, all evaporates when we understand the reality that we're created in the image and likeness of God. That means that God's Spirit is within us. What we call in spiritual language, the indwelling spirit. So if God is within me, how can I be a bad person? And that's the second lesson that comes to us in the first chapter of the book of Genesis, because God knows us well enough to know that God needed to drive that point home. And so if you read that first chapter and that first story of creation, you will see at the end that when God completes creation, God takes a step back, looks at everything, and says, it's good. God looked at everything and said, it's good. So stop there for a minute and think about that. We're created in the image and likeness of the higher power. And God says that's good. Therefore, there's no room in our awareness for shame, for believing that we're bad people, for believing that we're not good enough, for believing that we don't deserve sobriety, for holding on to the thoughts that have been placed there by our own inappropriate behaviors or the messages of others in judgment that said we're not good, because we are. And so we often refer to sobriety as a program of recovery. And if we think about that word, recover, we are trying to regain our original authentic selves. One of the greatest spiritual mystics of the 20th century, Thomas Merton, referred to this as reclaiming our true selves and shedding all of, I'll use the program language now, stinking thinking, distorted images, dysfunctional patterns of thinking and behaving, and the wounds that come for many of us even before active addiction, but certainly through the active addiction process, so that we can come back to our authentic essence, which is we are created in the image and likeness of God, and that we are good. And if we look to the rest of the Holy Scriptures in the traditions that I mentioned before, which Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob were particularly familiar with, the Judeo-Christian tradition, we begin to see the spirituality that emerges, that is rooted in the Holy Scriptures, when we hear in those stories that God loves us unconditionally, that God is willing and able to forgive us, that nothing that has occurred in our lives, no bad behavior, is unforgivable. We may not have that experience from some of the people in our lives, but from a spiritual perspective, our higher power is ready, willing, and able to forgive us. The hook, the accountability that comes with that, is our decision to change our attitudes and behaviors, right? The response on our part: thank you for forgiving me. Now I'm going to live differently. And I may not get it right the first time. I may not get it right the 100th time, but I'm going to keep trying. I'm going to keep trying to make changes in my attitudes and behaviors, because I want to no longer live in self-hate. I want to be able to love myself, and I want to be able to live as a sober person and break the chains that addiction places on us. Some would say that for people in recovery from addiction, sobriety gives the chance to get it right, precisely because in active addiction, people know how it got wrong, right? So we have the chance to get it right precisely because first we got it wrong. And that's not a judgment of our goodness. It's a reflection on the unmanageability that comes with active addiction. And the fact that there's great clarity in the hearts of people in recovery around the issue of unmanageability. Nobody who has survived addiction has any trouble understanding what unmanageability is, because they have lived it. So when we think about the spirituality of the 12 steps, and we think about the spirituality in recovery, we have as the foundation that we're created in the image and likeness of God, and that in that indwelling spirit, that energy of God's love, we are good fundamentally, genuinely, authentically. Many people in addiction recovery have lost touch with that truth, with that reality. And so the 12 steps assist in a precise practice of the 12 steps. It assists in the process of re-experiencing who we authentically are through the practice of those steps. It assists in reorienting our relationships away from exploitive relationships and toward mutual relationships based on trust, on affection, and on a desire to learn from one another and to serve one another. One of the other things that we learn as we become more familiar with the spirituality of recovery is that this intimacy that God offers is something that God desires very much. And so in the 11th step, we have a strong promise, if you will, that through prayer and meditation, we will cultivate that intimacy. And if you think about this from a logical perspective, it makes sense. Because if you want to develop a deeper friendship with a person, then the best way to do that is to spend time with them. And if you want to feel closer and understand more deeply another person, you engage in a process of telling each other your story, learning how, using little steps, how to trust yourself, how to trust the other person, and ultimately develop an intimacy. I'm talking about friendship here. I'm talking about closeness. I'm talking about support. And that's what God is desperate to have with each one of us as well. And so prayer becomes an active experience of us talking to our higher power and our higher power responding, of us listening for that response. And I'll have some more to say about that in subsequent presentations. So our higher power is desperate for this intimacy and invites us over and over again. And the program suggests to us that our prayer and meditation doesn't happen once a week on Sunday morning or Friday night or some other time when we're in a worship space, but that the prayer and meditation occurs every day, and perhaps more than even once a day. That's a suggestion, at least. And so if we practice the 12 steps, we become more understanding of the spiritual foundation of our program. And we begin to understand that if we can accept the reality of our strengths and our limitations, if we can accept that we are both good and wounded at the same time, and that that's okay, and that our higher power loves us, if we can commit to honesty, no more secrets, no more cons, no more games, no more exploitation in our relationships, we can begin to recover our authentic self. We can begin to experience a depth of spirituality that we never knew before. If we can begin to understand that in the fellowships of self-help, we practice relationships again. We learn little by little by listening to the experience, strength, and hope of others, how to trust, how to love, how to regain some sense of sanity in our lives. All of that will lead us to an intimacy with our higher power and a commitment to cultivating that intimacy. And when we have those realities in our lives, we feel compelled to want to share that with others. And that's the 12th step. Loving service, reaching out to those who are still struggling, comforting those who are suffering, sharing our experience, strength, and hope, calling back those who have lost their way, bringing them home, and encouraging them to look at themselves differently and to ask God for assistance in returning to a life that is radically different and much more in keeping with what the higher power wants for us. To love ourselves, to live in fellowship as opposed to isolation, and to share the wisdom that we have been given by others with those who are still struggling. Sisters and brothers, that is a very brief way to talk about the spiritual foundation of the 12 steps and the recovery process. I offer those reflections and I ask you to open your hearts to hear the truth and the wisdom. None of what I've said today comes from me or my understanding of some spiritual tradition. It comes from all those who have shown me the way, who have helped me to understand how to live differently and how to understand the spirituality of this program. So I offer these reflections to each one of you. I encourage you to open your hearts to the higher power, to pray and to meditate frequently, and to ask for the assistance and the fellowships that we need and that we deserve, so that we can continue to deepen our sobriety and continue to have sobriety take hold in our lives. So I wish you peace. I wish you the blessings of the higher power as you understand that God's energy of love may fill your hearts, comfort you, especially in these difficult times, and give you the perseverance you need to stay focused in sobriety and to learn how to care for yourselves and each other. So God bless you all. Thank you.